Welcome to the Foul Front Waterfowl Podcast, where our goal is to recruit, educate, and inspire new hunters and to entertain the rest of you. Without the mentorship of responsible, conservation-minded hunters, this passion as we know it faces an uncertain future. So please stick around and be sure to check out our Facebook group, Foul Front Waterfowl Podcast, and like our main page at Foul Front Outdoors right after this episode. All right. Well, should we get it started?
Let's do this.
Okay. So first and foremost, this is my brother, Zach Page, today that we have on the podcast. Zach Page is a project manager that is in charge of training for a software company. He enjoys philosophy, critical thinking, and ethics. And I think enjoys is a slight... What's the opposite word? It's an underwhelming...
underwhelming amount of reading or what?
Yeah. So let's do some like rapid fire questions so we can get to know you just a little bit better. What's your degree in?
I've got undergraduate degrees in psychology and philosophy, and then I've got a master's degree in psychology.
Okay, where are you from?
Originally from the Grundy Center area. I was born in a small town called Creston, Iowa, but born and raised there, then kind of the rest of my life in Grundy Center. About 6 years ago, Stacy and I, my wife, moved out to Colorado Springs. So that's where we've been at now for, like I said, about 5-6 years, and we love it.
Yes. All right. Have you ever shot a duck?
I've played a ton of duck hunt. Is that the type? Does that count?
Yeah, sure, maybe. So besides the video game, have you ever gone hunting?
When I was younger, a few times we went out hunting with Dad, mostly kind of clay pigeon shooting, but I think we went out hunting pheasant a few times, but never a time that I ever remember actually like being a successful hunt. So I'm sure we kids probably messed it up.
Sure. I think I did a little bit more later on with Dad, but those early years not so much. But all right, so. Then why are you on this podcast?
Well, that is a good question. I think you and I kind of started you and I discussing this when we were just kind of debating some things and talking about, you were kind of educating me a bunch on things that I just didn't know about hunting. And I like to argue so much, and I like philosophy and ethics so much that, of course, that just kind of organically developed out of that. So I think that's where we first started talking about maybe bringing me on the podcast to discuss kind of ethics and critical thinking as it relates to hunting.
Right. And, you don't come from a strong hunting. It's not something you go out and you do for enjoyment. And
right.
You generally lean you're vegetarian most of the time, right? Except for when I'm in town.
Mostly vegetarian. It's true, exactly. And when there's when I want to try something new, I'm mostly vegetarian, but I break on occasion, which is really atypical for vegetarians. Usually, it's kind of an all or none thing.
Right. Well, let's get into what this particular podcast episode is about. So this podcast episode is designed to help hunters and conservationists unpack or explore their code of ethics when it comes to hunting, and then to prepare them to have an intelligent argument for why you hunt in a world that's either hostile or even worse, indifferent to hunting, and kind of a guide to help, or a probe to get you to start thinking about some of these things.
Yeah. I think one of the things that makes me passionate about it, even though, you're right, I typically lean left on some of these issues, or what would be referred to as leaning left. I'm kind of a vegetarian. I don't hunt. I mostly would consider myself a pacifist. But at the same time, I really think that there's a lot of just kind of negative dialogue back and forth between both groups. Since I'm a vegetarian who often eats meat, I often find myself when I'm with other vegetarians, they think that's very, very odd behavior, as I said, because it's normally kind of an all or none thing. But then conversely, if I'm eating with a bunch of hunters, it's usually odd that I eat mostly vegetarian, but don't mind. So I just know I think this conversation is really important to help kind of bring people together, because there's a lot more division between hunters and non-hunters, I think, than there really needs to be. That's what kind of gets me jonesed for the topic.
Right. And I agree with that completely, because your wife, Stacy, my sister-in-law, she is, she's very
yeah, she's 100% vegetarian.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Was vegan for a lot of years. Has a lot of really, really passionate views about hunting as well. And her and I like to talk about that. We agree on most things, but of course,
and and me and her, we're best of friends. She's one of my best friends. So it's one of those things where it doesn't need to be. I think there's a lot of misinformation between the two groups.
Well, there absolutely is. There absolutely is. And I think that's as good a place as any to really launch into it. There's so much misinformation on both sides. I remember thinking a lot of really, really silly things before I started kind of having conversations with you, and just kind of vice versa. A lot of people, we always tell the story when I first became a vegetarian, a lot of folks are just like, what do you eat? Well, nobody's trying to be mean, of course, about that. They just literally don't know. It's kind of foreign to them.
Yeah. The first time Stacy came to Thanksgiving, my mom sent all of us kids out to the store to, hey, find something vegetarian to so Stacy can eat. And when I got back, the entire downstairs fridge was full of lettuce.
250 heads of lettuce. Yeah.
And every single one of us had bought like a head of lettuce. I don't know what, so.
Yeah, when I read into these topics on kind of both sides, you can really see how often heated it gets, and so I think that's just wildly important, right, to open that dialogue.
All right, let's dive in, I guess.
Let's go.
All right.
I think the best place to start, of course, is to put up some kind of ground rules for the discussion, right? So there are certain types of people that when they were to come up to argue about this, would just immediately be hostile. Okay. So I'm wanting to kind of put to the side a little bit folks who are truly hostile, right? If you're walking down the street and you've got a camo hat on and somebody just, shouts murderer from across the road, that's just not productive dialogue in any way. Right. So, I think it's good to know that those folks who are truly just either super ignorant, they don't know, or they're super passionate, who knows, on both sides, you've got to just be able to temper that. So I think the first good starting point is to recognize that, if you come across somebody who's just super dogmatic in anything they're saying, there's just a good chance you're not going to be able to have any impact on them, So it's also kind of choosing your battles, right? Knowing that it's okay for two people to just disagree as well. Right. When you start to kind of talk about ethics, there's also kind of like categories of ethics, right? You have kind of like theoretical ethics where it's just completely kind of a thought experiment in how we kind of ought to behave. Then you've also got like your own personal ethics or individual ethics, right? That you just are going to use to kind of guide your life. But then there's also like political ethics and government ethics. Right. What are the laws? What are the laws that we bring in? So in a lot of debates, the lines between those different forms kind of blur, right? And so you'll kind of start out having a kind of theoretical conversation about ethics, and then all of a sudden it will merge into a discussion about what the actual laws and regulations are. So it's good to just kind of be clear, where you're fitting. A lot of things that we might, enjoy doing, or I might like to do personally, I don't want there to be a law against it, right? Maybe I wouldn't do that, but I don't necessarily think that there needs to be a law against it. So it's really important to keep those kind of things, basic understandings in mind when you start to kind of engage in dialogue with somebody about these topics.
Right. So I guess let's just why does anybody care?
This is such a good point. I think it really is. To me, of course. So part of the reason why I'm on the podcast, what gets Jones for me, is I enjoy this process just in general. Right. I think anybody who's hunted has to have, you and I have had a lot of conversations where you've told me maybe hunting stories and experiences you've had, but almost everybody that I know that's a hunter has at some point gotten involved in the type of argument that we're going to discuss, on the podcast here today.
Yeah.
Everybody I know has that argument where, maybe they were, at a family event and it was like, oh yeah, I've got some, and you were kind of bragging about maybe you've got your own deer jerky at home, as you're eating this, and that, daggers stare from across the hall and somebody's like, what, are you a hunter? I think everybody's just kind of had that experience if they're a hunter where they felt judged.
And I think it's even worse than someone who's anti-hunting or whatnot, is that we also have a lot of infighting as well. There's a lot of different levels of and opinions on ethics and whatnot, and I think a lot of the infighting actually, or I think most of the conflict is in fact between hunters, but some of the worst, I think, would probably be between the whole non-hunting, or those people that they're not so much non-hunters, they just don't hunt. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. There definitely seems to be different categories. I feel like I fit into like the I just don't hunt category, right?
I think it's a bell curve. Obviously it's a bell curve. There's 10% on the left, 10% on the right, and then everybody in the middle who doesn't really give a, or gives varying degrees of,
Yeah. And I think that that's just it, you've got to be able to diagnose kind of, if you will, the type of person that you're getting involved with.
And you have to be, I think you have to be careful with so it's usually that left 10% and that right 10% that are arguing it out and having the conversation, but that other 80% is listening and forming opinions.
Well, that's just it. That is just it, right? Sure, a lot of times those who are the most quiet are also can be the most influential, right? You think about that silent majority, and unfortunately, a lot of times all you hear about are the radical sides of either position, right? So I think there's such a good message there. In general. But what about you? Have you felt that a lot? Do you feel judged for being a hunter? What are the types of experiences that you've had mostly? Of course, you're from the Midwest, so that's kind of there's a lot of hunters in the Midwest. Of course, there's a lot of hunters everywhere.
Yeah.
But how have you felt about that?
I'd say by and large, it's most of the reactions I get when people, come over to the house, or people that we meet, and, they see that I'm wearing, some sort of brown hat with a, deer sticker or something on the back of my truck. And they, are you a hunter? So I say, oh yeah, I am. And it's generally met with a very kind of a mysterious, like, oh yeah, you're one of those crazy guys that wakes up at 5 a.m. to go kill a poor defenseless animal. And then, you do, I do get like, well, you hunt? You don't need to hunt. Like, you can just go to the store and buy that stuff. Like, you don't have to go like you can go get your meat where, no animal was harmed.
Right. As though you forgot that there were supermarkets and you were like, what? You just stock this stuff on shelves?
You're kidding me. So I've gone 6 years without shooting a turkey, and you telling me I can just pick one up at the store?
Oh, that's hilarious.
Wow.
But, it's just so true. I think you even hit the nail on the head with how you described that experience there with, kind of killing a defenseless animal. I think ultimately the biggest reason why I feel this topic gets so heated is because the ultimate question is often just kind of posed, why are you ethically justified in taking the life of that animal? Right. I think at the end of the day, most of the most heated arguments stem from that kind of discussion. Of course, it's, how can you cause harm to this creature that wasn't asking for it? And that's where I think it's basically, what do we make of that question and how do we articulate that question that I think shapes a lot of the debate. right?
Right.
I fall on the side that I think it's very, very hard to just directly justify in the here and now taking the life of an animal. But I also don't necessarily think that that's necessary when you compare it to all the other things that we have to do in life, right? And I think that's where most people kind of don't get it. You know, you think of the stereotypical argument, oh, I can't believe you're murdering that animal. Well, is that person that's saying that a vegetarian, right? Right out of the gate, if you're just essentially blaming somebody else for hunting, but you still support the killing of animals, you still eat animals yourself, you know, all these things, you really just don't have a leg to stand on, right? It really just at that point is kind of a judgment.
Yeah, it's a moot point because, I mean, if you're participating, and I full disclaimer, of course, I not all of my food comes from, you know, my hunting. I still get beef. I still, participate in the meat market game.
Right.
And yeah, so if you're still participating in the meat market game, in my opinion, you don't have the grounds to stand on, like you said, to come to me and say, hey, how dare you go, quickly and ethically try to take an animal's life instead of, a wild animal's life instead of, continuing to participate in the meat farm.
Well, and I think that's just it. You have to be very, very precise. And in a lot of the arguments that I've either been in myself or witnessed, there's just a ton of imprecise speech. And you know how I go on and on about how much I love precise speech. There's nothing more amazing to me than a precisely worded sentence.
Yeah. Disclaimer for the audience here. It is not fun to be in an argument with my brother. It don't even matter. Like he could not even care what the other side of the argument is. He'll just argue it with me, and yeah, you got to watch your tongue on that. So let's get into it then. Let's get into some of these specifics. Like, what are we talking about?
Well, yeah, I think right there, the first question is when a person levels the accusation. Let's just start with killing an animal, right? Okay. Are you making the claim that to make the argument, I can't believe that you're a hunter. I would never kill an animal, and I would never participate in any behavior that resulted in the killing of an animal. If that is the extreme argument that you make, then it's going to be very easy to kind of find a counterpoint. Right? If you're really saying that you would never do that, how do you justify your eating of animals? How do you justify, shopping at restaurants that support that? Right? Even if you're a full-on vegetarian, there's arguments about they still have to maybe often kill geese and rabbits to protect the crops. Right? So if you're leveling the accusation using "I would never do that," then of course you're open to all these objections. Right? At the same time, some people would in many other ethical disciplines, we do change the ethical status based on whether or not you physically did it yourself versus whether or not you contributed to it, right? So it is true when you think of something like murder of a human, right? Typically, the penalty would be more severe if you actually murdered the person yourself than if you led to the person being murdered, right? And that's not true in all cases, but basically we would say, oh, yeah. It's kind of, quote, worse to have done it yourself than it would been have to have participated it, by
yeah, so there's an element of disassociation
exactly.
Or distance from the actual kill site that can give you a lot of not a false sense, but what's the word here? Give you something like a moral stance over someone else that a proposed moral stance over someone else.
Right. And that's where I'm saying I don't deny that there are other areas in which we would apply that same logic, but most people apply it too strongly. Yeah. Where they're trying, they might be very kind of, maybe they're even ignorant about all the other behaviors that they do that actually contribute to that because they're just not knowledgeable. So to me, how you word that argument, what is it specifically that you're saying? I would definitely say I try not to kill any animals, but I know that that's sometimes going to happen. Right. And so I think taking steps to reduce it is fine. But I'm also not making strong claims about being kind of holier than thou to folks who do hunt, right? I don't think I'm any better than somebody who doesn't hunt. Do I want to hunt? No. Do I think that since I don't hunt, I'm on a higher ethical footing than somebody who does? Ooh, I don't know how I would justify that. Right? I don't know how I would, because I'm not a complete vegetarian, because I don't donate a lot of money right now to charities that support that cause, right?
Right.
So I don't think there's anything. It's just at this point, it's a choice, right? It's just a personal choice of mine to emit the behaviors that I do.
Yeah. As always, this episode is brought to you in part by High Prairie Sportsmen, a group of conservation-minded outdoorsmen and women who have a lot of great content over on YouTube. Just go search for High Prairie Sportsmen over there, and you'll be entertained for hours, and you might even learn something. They're very close friends of the show, and without them, a lot of this stuff wouldn't be possible. Okay, back to the show.
Yeah.
I think it's important moving forward in this conversation to let the listeners know, like, don't base your opinions off of my responses so much to my personal stuff. This is designed to, when these questions get asked, answer them yourself. You know what I mean? Try to think of where you actually stand on it. Don't worry about where Ben stands on it so much. If I happen to help guide you along and into something that you think is good, but it's worth it for you to sit down and take the time to examine these things.
Yeah, I really see that's such good advice. And I really see conversations like this, of course, very much like wrestling, very much like, playing a game of basketball together.
Right.
To me, that absolutely is a sport. Not only are you like testing out different ways of thinking, right? Because sometimes you don't fully know your own opinions, right, until you've had to talk through them a bunch. So it's really like a form of training and a form of working out. And so absolutely you should, think deeply about the same questions and kind of listen organically. I think that's the best way to grow from arguments like this.
Yeah. And the first time you do this, the first time you don't want to go to your basketball game without ever having done any practice. And I don't think a lot of hunters get a lot of practice. They don't, usually we're surrounded mostly by like-minded folks, and we don't explore the boundaries of our inner thinking on the things that we absolutely love to do.
Yeah.
All right.
So, yeah, I think one of the next topics that I'd like to discuss is to kind of just quickly go through the basic argument. I think some of the basic arguments that are available for and against killing animals, right? And if you pick up any one of the great books, that's available on this topic, at least several of the books that I've read through kind of start this way as well and kind of outline this, right? When somebody says that it's not okay to kill animals, they're usually talking about, the preservation of life is what's the most important, right? You're not justified in taking the life of another animal against its will, right? Yeah. So you might have a rebuttal to that by saying, but it's my right to kind of act as I will. There are some people who make justifications either, maybe you would cite the Bible, maybe you would cite some other source that animals are either below us or at least of a different ethical status, right? And I think that makes sense. A lot of times you hear an argument, for example, imagine there was a little boy drowning in a pond, and then there was also a puppy dog drowning in the pond. Who do you jump in to save? This is a kind of an ethical thought experiment that's often posed, right? The idea presumably being that if you were to save that everybody would save the child and not the animal, right?
Right. A little bit of speciesism there. So,
well, that's just the problem with it, right? Although you're right that you might say that. Well, of course, I'm probably going to save my kid maybe over my dog. That is some speciesism in that you'll find yourself running into gray areas really, really quickly, right? That obvious example might work, but you find yourself needing to ask yourself that question of where do you draw the line, right? Do you for the person who says that they don't kill, well, do you also not kill insects? Is that where it stops, right? Of course, sometimes we've joked because we're catch and release in my house, right? We do our best to We're both terrified of spiders, terrified of bugs, but try to do our best to catch and release all the insects in our house. Now, once again, I see those as just behaviors that I like to emit. I like to do that. That's how I participate in nature, right? That's how I choose to do that. But you'd have to answer those questions about where do you draw that line, right? With the sanctity of life, at what point do you draw that line? When do you think that it is okay? And I think that's kind of the heart of that question.
Right.
So where do you fit on that? What do you think? Obviously, the next counterexample would be, somebody saying, well, if you will kill a wild animal, right? You must just be this savage person. What is your justification? Why do you immediately say, no, that I'm justified in this? That's not unethical. What's your answer?
Right. So and it always comes back down to, it always seems like, oh, the hunters you're a monster, you're bloodlusty, and they assume obviously that they would love deer or ducks. They assume that they love those things more than I do, and I can guarantee it that you don't know, or I'm calling you out.
Right.
I know more about duck behavior, and I appreciate like seeing a duck. Ask my wife, how annoyed my wife gets when we're driving somewhere. All of a sudden I pull over next to this little pond and she's like, what's going on? I said, oh my gosh, go look at these ducks. Look at these. That's a redhead out there. And I have not seen one of those like all season, blah, 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 blah. They're such a beautiful, and she's just like, are you kidding me? Like, why are we pulled over on the side of the road so you can look at some ducks? And and it is, I truly do. Like, I just feel there's a strong connection to them. They literally, they wake me up in the morning,
right. 5
months out of the year.
That is the start too of all about, and I was ignorant of a lot of that as well, as a non-hunter, and you'd have to expect that, right? If you don't get exposed to it and you don't do it, you have to expect a certain amount of ignorance out of people rather than be frustrated with it, right? It's part of the thing that makes hunters good at what they do, right? Yeah, you've got knowledge that other people don't, like you experience things that other people don't, so often it does seem like if you kill an animal, then you must not like that animal, obviously, right? You must be kind of savage.
I think the most important part though is that I like the idea of those ducks. I like the idea of my daughter being able to do that in 50 years.
Well, that's just it.
To pull over. Yeah. And so whereas hunters, they're the ones that go out and we pay the money. You know what I mean? We're the ones out there, taking care of them. And I know that we've had this conversation before, but I like and I think it's Steve. Yes, I think it's Stephen Ranella that says I like the idea of deer a lot better than I like. And that might be the wrong quote, but essentially, sure. I like all of them as opposed to just the one.
Right, exactly. It's absolutely true. And I think that points to a good distinction to make in these arguments is a lot of times I think it will be beneficial for hunters to keep in mind that when somebody levels an accusation at them like this sanctity of life debate, they're often coming at it from a very kind of objective position. And in a lot of instances, the hunter's response, and this isn't a negative, it just helps explain sometimes why the message isn't conveyed. But sometimes the argument back is kind of a utilitarian one, right? Now, if the argument that you had against that person was it's never okay to hunt, right? There are no benefits from hunting or killing an animal. Then it would make sense to say, actually, we support X, Y, and Z, right? As a matter of fact, it does appear to be the case that revenue and such generated from hunting and hunting activities greatly exceeds other, contributions, that might be on their face more pro-green or pro-life, right? So I think that's a shock to a lot of people to find out, that information. Yeah. But at the same time, I think that's why the debate keeps going, because
we're not answering the right question.
Exactly.
We have the answer for yeah, we have the answer for a question, but it's not the question they asked.
Well, exactly. And I think that is definitely one of the things that I've seen stem or cause these types of arguments to balloon, right? Because that maybe ethical idealist or whatever who was talking about the sanctity of life, they're just getting more and more frustrated because they're hearing that response as though it was just kind of justification. They feel like they're not being heard, that we could make the process better, which is so tragic because so much about hunting is trying to make things better, right? Trying to improve the environment, trying to make it so that it's easier to control populations, right? Coming up with better and better hunting methods to make it quicker to kill the animal. So it's not as though I think that's what makes this kind of doubly harmful, these debates, is because it makes the other side kind of hardened, and then they don't even see all the good that the hunters are doing, and it can just kind of create this vicious circle. So I think that's just so important to keep opening that up.
Right. So, okay, well, what's the I know we should examine. We have our answer. It's a very utilitarian answer. Hey, we're the ones taking care of the resource. We're the ones, until you're shelling out as much money as I am, don't even come to the table.
Well, and that's an important distinction you just made. Until you're coming with as much, right? And from my perspective, I love that because I feel like that's a qualification to your argument. You're not stating no matter what, you will never come up with an argument that would make me hunt less. You're saying put your money where your mouth is, right? Show me, right? If you've got a better option, if you're saying that I've got a way to control the deer population, for example, I've got a way to control the goose population that will generate all this revenue, that will keep everything in homeostasis and such, and it doesn't involve hunting of any kind, right? I think the average hunter would be like, interesting. What do you got? Right?
Yeah, I you know what, that option, I mean, it does exist, but it would be the entire goal of our entire country, of this hemisphere, to keep that going. Every job, every industry almost would be geared towards conservation. And I mean, I don't know what the theoretical solution actually is, but I know that is whatever it is that they think that they can do. There's a reason hunting's around, because it's the most economical and
infinitely practical.
Yeah, practical. There you go.
It's infinitely practical. And although it might sound really, really nice to just be like, yeah, but they kill, so it's bad, right? When you just really start to think about how difficult it is to live that life, I think that at least tempers your thoughts, right? It tempers you. It brings you back to the middle a little bit.
Yeah.
Because people do with these issues, it involves life, right? What's more important than life in general? All of us hunters talk about the circle of life. They want the generate. Like you mentioned, you not only do you want your daughter to be hunting in 40 years, but you want your great granddaughter to be hunting in what that is, right? And so even hunters are worshiping life, just like the whoever it is that we're kind of arguing is the quote the other side, right? Maybe a stereotypical vegetarian. Of course, we're just we're like throwing labels out, right. Just to kind of point in the direction of the argument we mean, right? Obviously, my wife and I are both vegetarian. We argue differently on various topics and such. So of course those labels are not always perfect, but yeah, this other side often doesn't. Either they don't directly get exposed to that, or they just don't understand the extent to which hunters do help the environment. I think that's a really
in true form of our conversations. We've gone off again. So what's how do we examine
sin?
You there?
Yeah, I'm there. I was like, rein us in.
Yeah, rein us in. The question that they're asking, you know what I mean? We've answered in a utilitarian manner.
Yeah.
How do we look into, I think it's too easy. It's just too easy for us to just say, oh yeah, well, I take care of the animals and I do all this and stuff like that. But I think that if you're only coming from a utilitarian sense, or only examining your ethics and your morals of hunting through a utilitarian lens, I think you're doing a little bit of injustice. I mean, you spend all this time thinking about hunting and out there hunting. You should be able to come at yourself from a couple other angles to really round yourself out.
It is. That's the problem with utilitarian arguments in general, right? Is that you run the risk of these terrible arguments of not being able to defend yourself, right? Okay, what if, and again, that's a hypothetical, what if torturing animals prior to hunting them? Well, and this is a little bit controversial, but I think that's been leveled against the Yulin Dog Festival, right? And I'm kind of I don't know if you know much about it. Have you heard about this?
No.
It's often thrown around because there's a lot of it's a big festival where they like kill dogs. I even forget the country that it's in. Obviously, Yulin is where it's at. But there's even accusations that sometimes they actually torture the animals prior to this festival because they claim that it like makes the meat more tender. Now, I'm sure 50% of that is probably exaggeration and 50% not. So for our argument, of course, right here, it doesn't really matter how true that is. But let's put ourselves in a situation where it was true. If that became economical and that was a money revenue, then you'd have to say that was ethical. Right. And that's the risk of those utilitarian arguments, is that you'd have to say, well, it's true. Now, you might debate that ever would become, right? You might say, but that's not going to happen, right? Which is totally true, right? You might say, well, okay. But it is true that that's a hypothetical weakness of those arguments. If it's utilitarian, you run the risk of making it seem like, well, I can't justify this on its own, but at least it makes a lot of money. And it's good to recognize that, right? It is kind of, in some instances, could be seen as sidestepping the argument. Somebody has said the way that you behave is unethical, and your response in a nutshell is, yeah, but it makes a lot of money. Yeah, but it's the best we've got, which might be beneficial, but as you're right, it does kind of leave something to be desired, right?
Yeah.
It definitely does. So I think one of the best places to push from there is to kind of flip that. The best way to kind of work through the argument is to kind of flip it and start to go the other way, and ask yourself, why is hunting to kill unethical? Like, why? Ask yourself why it's unethical. What is it about killing that makes it unethical, right? And most people would say, well, because it causes harm to animals, right? Well, lots of things cause harm to animals, right? This is where I think some of these the arguments come in for hunting about population control and disease and controlling the populations, right? In many instances, it actually just is not utilitarian, but just a fact that to kill the animal in the process that it normally happens with hunting is quicker and probably in many instances way less painful. And really what by all other accounts would be referred to as more humane, right? We all recognize that, euthanasia is a big concept. So a lot of people feel passionate that if you get to an end stage in life, you'd like the ability to potentially choose to, go out more peacefully or with more dignity than have a long drawn out battle with health concerns, right? So I think some of those arguments are really strong for hunters in actually just directly justifying the behavior, right? Mm-hmm. If you didn't do this, right? If we did not hunt, all these other things would be caused. And as long as you're open to saying, if you can drone strike these animals to get the exact same benefit, that's just as cheap, just as sustainable, right? And such, then go for it. Right?
Then what do you say about what about there's got to be some an opinion on, there has been, if hunting stops tomorrow, like nobody could hunt anymore, that would be the first time in the entire history of humans that there was not hunting. There's we're in a really weird age where there is less hunters than there are non-hunters. You know what I mean?
Well, it's true.
I mean, for in the dawn of the species ourselves, that people were out there, killing mastodons and stuff. And I think it's, what do you say about the culture, the North American culture specifically of waterfowling? Grandpa, I don't know if you knew this, Grandpa was a big duck hunter.
Oh, no, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Grandma told me that she'd take the kids to church on Sunday, and Grandpa and his boys would go out and drink beer on the river and shoot ducks.
Right.
So
yeah, there's definitely something to be said for that, and that line of argumentation comes up for a lot of different things, right? Not wanting to equate them, but there are lots of different things that are kind of defended by saying they're kind of natural, right? They've been around forever. We've been doing this. I think that those are great arguments. I personally think those are great arguments for making it so that you aren't seen as evil. Right. It's very important, I think, to make it so that you don't see the act or the process as evil. But I think it does, in some instances. I fall on the side that says I still think that that's not targeting the heart of the issue. But of course, I think I stated at the outset that I think this is a topic where you should kind of sidestep that. I think that hunters should remain silent on the ethicality of the kill, except when referring to the population control type arguments. That's what I think are the strongest arguments. And of course, that's just my opinion, meant to kind of spur you to think about those.
Yeah.
But I do. I think those are some of the strongest arguments. But
do we want to maybe step into we pick up the different lenses real quick and have a quick, I don't know, mock you ask a question on why, and we can kind of unpack it through those methods. You know what I'm saying? Just in maybe 2 or 3, just the most common ways that hunters should be looking out to defend themselves, and not just switching over and sidestepping into that utilitarian role.
Sure. So, the first question would be, somebody comes up to you and says, hunting is unethical. And you ask them, well, why? What is it that you think is bad about ethics or bad about hunting? And they say, because it causes harm to animals. Well, I think a good answer to say, a good way to respond is, well, I totally understand your concern, right? Because hunters do. Don't forget to restate that you really do understand that concern. But that you believe that lots of things cause harm to animals, and that you like to actually participate directly in an activity that decreases that. That's what you kind of get jonesed about, right? And you can also remind folks that of the different ways that some things that we commonly think are helpful to animals are actually hurtful, right? A big one to me was not understanding the difference between deer that somebody has hunted and what happens when you actually go to McDonald's and fast food restaurants, and how those animals are treated, right? In many instances, when that person is saying it causes harm to animals, they're thinking about that kind of harm, right? We've maybe seen those videos where a cow is getting pushed around by a forklift, right? That just makes almost any human being cringe, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, gun to your head, you get to choose to either come back as a cow or come back as a deer. Which one are you going to choose?
Right. So that's another way that I think directly is not utilitarian. That's actually saying, I hear your concern, and I want to express to you that I genuinely do believe that I'm participating in an activity that causes less harm, right? Just directly.
Well, then you're also getting into just like me, for instance. Yes. Do I have deer in my freezer? Yes. Do I have beef in my freezer? Yes. Do I have chickens from the local Dillon supermarket in my freezer? Yeah. So what's the, so now I'm not pulling all of my meat from the land. So you can't, I personally, if certain members of my household liked to eat game meat a lot more frequently, we would.
Sure.
But we don't. And so then what do you say, part of it is, there's no hunters that I know that none of us needs to be a sustenance hunter. Now, mind you, there are lots of people out there that try to replace their all their meat with game that they take.
Right.
Totally. They don't have to. It's a choice. Now there are people up in Alaska, people that legit out in the bush that, it's their option, or it's, they're out there living that life, but that's the way that they bring food to the market. And then you have to remember too, there's my good buddy Kevin Fontenot, who I had on episode number 3. We were talking about pigs, wild pigs, and he said, there's only 2 instances in which wild pigs I think are beneficial, because wild pigs are generally a bad and invasive species. I'm not sure if you knew that. They destroy a lot of habitat.
Yeah, destructive.
Only thing that they do though is on the lake, near the lake beds and stuff, they actually seed or they push the seeds down into the mud and basically till up the mud, and creates excellent duck habitat when it comes back up. And he said the only and then he brought up something that I'd never thought of, because you and I, yes, we've definitely dug really deep into our wallets for that last $5 to go buy a case of beer.
Right.
We've done that, but we've never been hard up. We've never missed a meal. You know what I mean?
Right.
And pigs have fed a lot of families.
Right.
And it comes down all to that is okay. So, I guess what I'm going to round about here is that most of us are sport hunters.
Right. Not exclusively sustenance hunters.
Yeah. I'm a sport hunter, and I absolutely eat everything that I kill. And I like to replace, stuff that I buy at the store with stuff that I, went and bought out at the big store.
It's true. And, I think a lot of a related line, I think, of argumentation there has to do with just like sustenance and more sustainable gardening, right? Like one of the first steps is like transitioning, right? Maybe you can't have a garden that completely sustains you, right? We don't have an acreage, but we're still decreasing the amount, right? How much more would you need to be buying if you weren't hunting that? But I think the big difference is just allow whatever it is that you do to just honestly temper your argument, right? Don't also try to get on a high horse that you're only doing it because you eat it, you need to eat it, right? There's still a great argument that you're decreasing the amount of meat that you're buying at your Walmarts and your wherever that you're buying stuff at supermarkets, right? So even if you're not 100%, you're still decreasing the amount that you're using.
Right.
But I think, for me, I see all of these arguments as kind of fitting into two camps. One of them is on the ethics of taking a life, which I just think is really, really difficult. I think it's usually beneficial to steer away from that directly because it's complex and it's a really, really hot button issue. And to focus more on the sustainability, arguments. And so if somebody's really being mean or aggressive and heavy-handed with that, guide them back to the benefits of hunting, guide them back to the positives, right? Don't try to take a really hard-nosed stance, not because you can't or because that there's no possible way to justify it, but because it's just so much more complex and likely to lead into arguments,
Yeah. I think kind of an issue though, and what I hear, is don't be a dick is what I hear.
Right.
The issue is you don't want to be. We're all ambassadors to our own. Well, we're ambassadors to the sport of hunting or the passion of hunting, whatever you want to call it. But I'm not going to stand down and silently let hunting slip into the night. You know what I'm saying?
Well, that's it. That's it. Yeah. And so I think the best way to make sure that happens is, if somebody's really hard nosed with this is killing, this is wrong. Mm-hmm. That's what I think. If you come out really, really strong saying it's absolutely not, it's our right to do this, there's just a good chance that, believe it or not, you're going to turn them off. This was one of the hardest things for me, as you mentioned how difficult it can sometimes be arguing with me, right? This is one of the hardest things. And I remember my wife kind of coming to me one time and saying, are you more interested in being right or convincing people that you're right? right?
Right.
Like what's more important to you? And of course, if I was being truly ethical, I want to just be convincing people, right? Because otherwise, what the heck am I spouting these views for, right?
Yeah.
So you want to be influential, right? You want to try to help. Like you said, you want to help hunting, right? You want to, in some instances, change people's minds, right? Who truly think kind of ignorantly, so that they can have a more well-rounded view themselves. But in other instances, you just want to make sure that people don't see you as an enemy, right? That they don't see you as an adversary, but an ally in this fight for ecology, getting to a better place, right? And so I think that's why it's a hot button issue for the non-hunter or the anti-hunter, if you want to call them that. It's that life, taking a life thing is a hot button issue. Rightfully so for them because of what they're triggered on. And the hunter is rightfully so triggered by saying, who are you, right? How are you holier than thou? Because, you're totally ignorant about this topic and yet you have this view. So that's why I think it can just be so beneficial to guide it back towards not going down that path. Don't bite at that hook. Don't try to go down that path unless, like I said, you're really, really close with somebody, like the conversations that you and I have had. And it's always just better to help educate them. Ask them why. Ask them about that. Why do they feel that way, right? Ask them some questions. Why is it that you feel so passionately, right? Because you've already admitted you'd agree that you love life and you love wildlife, right? So go back to what you're in agreement with, right? When that accusation happens, and that'll buy you that time, one, to restructure your arguments, right? So you don't have to feel like, I can't believe this person, right? Because I think hunters are rightfully so offended that way, right? Here you are doing something that we've been doing for thousands of years that has all these health benefits to the individual person in terms of hobbies and, getting exercise, depending on the type of hunting that you do. There's all these benefits. And yet here is this person saying that what you do and what you enjoy is unethical or bad. Right. So rightfully so, you would get frustrated by that. So it's just so important to try to temper that and really recognize how much you've learned about hunting by being a hunter, right? By listening to podcasts like this. Recognize it as your real strength. And so do your best to, as you said, don't be a dick. Do your best to kind of temper that, not only because it will help you feel better, right? But because it's also the most likely way for you to actually influence that other person, that vegetarian, that anti-hunter, that whatever, label we want to throw at that other. It's the best likelihood of reaching common ground and truly helping that other person understand the ways that you do, right? And then you'll also open yourself up to, since that person will also read off of you and temper their arguments, you've got a better chance also of learning from that, from that other person as well.
Yeah. And that's the thing is never judge never judge a Zach until you walk a mile in his sandals, and never judge a Ben until you walk a mile in his boots. And right. And I remember me and Stacy were having a conversation. I think when was that? But I said, "Hey, I'm going to take you deer hunting," and she was like, "No." And I said, no, we won't bring a gun. We won't bring my bow. Like, we're just going to go out and we'll go, like, wouldn't you like to go see these animals in real life? And she was like, well, yeah, duh. And I said, well, that's like 99% of the time what I'm doing out there. And then there's this other 1% where, is where we actually are different,
Well, it's true. And that's why it's always just so important when these arguments come up, when people start talking about this, go back to common ground. Remember that you are a conservationist. You are a hunter. You are interested in wildlife. And so is this other person. Right. Yep. And so is this other person, even if they might have an incredibly ignorant view from your perspective. Right. Even if they seem to be being mean to you, all the better reason to temper that argument, to come back to find that common ground. What do we agree upon? What are we really doing? That's what opened the doors for me to learning a lot more about hunting. A lot of the arguments I had that were kind of anti-hunter arguments early on, I quickly got rid of, from having those types of dialogue, right? From being able to really ask those questions. And has there been a time in your past where you were like looking at my pictures or thinking like, Ben,
Yeah, savage.
I don't like the hunting pictures, of course. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't like the kill shots afterwards.
Yeah.
That type of would always be triggering to me.
Yeah. That leads me to I'm going to get on just a pedestal real quick. And I've got a platform for it. I'm going to say it. And a lot of my friends do this, and it's so annoying to me. PETA made a Facebook filter maybe like a year and a half, 2 years ago. It said, shoot selfies, not animals.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
And there's this huge push where every hunting photo one of my buddies has, and you are listening to this, you know who you are, you big jerk. Every picture that he has, he put that filter on, like him holding up, one of his, birds, and it says shoot selfies, not animals.
Right.
And it's a selfie of him with a bird. Like, and that is just this, I see that and I just like shake my finger at my friends. And like, I know there's people listening to this and I don't mean to offend you. It's just my thing. It's like, gosh, guys, like there's not that many of us out there. We need to be careful. Like that 80% is listening and you're just trying to tick off the other 10% that was trying to tick you off. Like take the high road, let the 80% see that it's frustrating. So.
You and I have had conversations about that a lot as well. And so my position that, I think it's so important to maintain shared facts, and shared understanding of things so that you can keep talking rationally to each other. So it can be so easy to get offended or just post things that are silly. And it can. Sometimes it can hurt the dialogue. Should the person really be punished for that? Who knows? That's another discussion, right? Should there be any negative consequences for doing it? But probably,
and I was thinking about it today in preparation for this conversation, and I'm just as guilty as anybody else. I went out into the wilderness and I collected the bounty that I set forth, and I dropped my tailgate and I put them on there and I take a picture of it. You know what I mean? And it shows I want to share that with people. Like, hey, look, I went out in this. The thing, though, that it doesn't do a good job of portraying is I thought about, okay, what's one of my favorite like duck hunting memories? And besides from all the fun that I have with my friends while we're out there,
right?
Well, literally, like one of the coolest things that's ever happened to me was I couldn't hunt a particular situation, and so like if I would have shot, I would have killed like 15 birds. But I had, like 60 or 70 birds piled up into like this tiny little water hole. And I didn't even, my hand wasn't even on my gun because it was impossible for me to take an ethical shot where I didn't just go over the limit. And I just got to just watching like, frustration and wonder and awe of like, oh my gosh, like I am literally 20 yards away from like these ducks. They don't know I'm here and they're just doing duck stuff. And I didn't get a picture of that.
Right.
But it's burned in my memory forever. And it's like one of my, favorite things. And maybe, it's bad on me for not being able to capture that or, be able to share that as much as, sharing, there goes Ben killing a limit of ducks again.
Well, sure. And I think that's just what, we all have to just be as mindful as we can about our hobbies. It's easy to misrepresent things, right? Because you're right. For every, shooting pick that you might have or end of the shoot, end of the hunt pick you might have, how many countless other pictures could you have taken that they didn't have the opportunity to? So yeah, it's true, that you've got to kind of weigh that. It's absolutely true.
Yeah. Well, here's a little fun. Should we demystify any hunting for you, or do you have any questions?
Yeah, I think I do. So, some of the things that you and I have talked about is a lot of the kind of financial benefits of hunting programs and what they do. So, I live in Colorado now, so we go hiking. One interesting line of argumentation that I've seen is, right, when I go hiking, I don't really sure. I had to buy a new pair of boots, right? I had to buy a new pair of boots to go hiking. So I'm putting into the economy a little bit, right? And I buy various, bottles of water and such. So I'm not saying there's no money, but for the most part, I'm just blessed that I can go on tons and tons of hiking, and I'm not required to have any financial investment in it, right?
Right. Yeah. Talking about the public land and the money that contributes that in the North American conservation model, I think is probably what you're asking about.
I guess essentially, I know that. Of course, a gun costs more than my hiking boots. A fishing license, I don't need a hiking license. I can see I get some of the basic money that comes. But what is this kind of the overview of that basic model?
Yeah. So, okay. Well, first and foremost, just to answer your question about gear and stuff like that, the Pittman-Robertson Act. I don't know what year that was, but anyways, I'm pretty, like firearm tax. It's a special firearm tax. So instead of that money going to the regular pool of wherever the tax money goes, that actually goes to the Department of the Interior. For them in the Department of the Interior, they manage all the public lands, essentially. Well, not all of them, but a good chunk of them. And then that's things like pretty much like everything that you buy at Cabela's is going to be, close to falling under the Pittman-Robertson Act.
Right.
And that money goes to those taxes go to the Pittman-Robertson Act. And then you've got, like I said, like what we were talking about, the licensing, the tags, all that stuff like that. When it comes down to it, everything has a dollar value on it, right?
Right.
Everything does. And if something's not worth money, it's not going to be around anymore. And so everybody's gets all up in arms, when they're paying, $60 for a deer tag, but you have to look at it and say, well, that's $60 that you're directly contributing. Take that $60 and take it out of your donation to. If you can only spend $100, take that out of your donation to Ducks Unlimited that year or something. I'm not saying to do that, by the way.
Right.
I'm
maybe in a budget. Charity is on a budget.
We have a budget, well. But what I'm saying is that your money is going towards conservation when you buy these things, and hunters and anglers are footing the bill for everybody else.
No, it's kind of true. What do you how would your position, I guess one good question I think also that all hunters can ask themselves to kind of help center themselves too, in terms of where they're at, just because it's a good question to ask yourself to find out where you personally lie on this continuum. But what would it take for you to believe that it was unethical to take a life? You've talked to me quite a bit about how just a moment ago in your story, you had talked about you couldn't take an ethical shot. Right. I think you remember that time too when we went out with some of your buddies, not to actually hunt, but we were just walking around in the back 40 or whatever, and I think your buddy drew down on a deer with like a BB gun or a pellet gun, and of course
he was using the scope to look at it.
Exactly, look at it. Yeah, exactly. And I think he wouldn't even.
I remember you just about Zach, we were out raccoon hunting.
Yeah, that's right.
We were trying to get some beer money. And I wanted to take you, and I it was a bad idea. I knew it was when buddy's little brother and I hopped in the back of the truck with a baseball bat, and you were thinking to yourself, why do we need a baseball bat? Like
anything that requires the use of a baseball bat, I assure you. But I think what. So obviously hunters do. There are shots that they will not take, right?
Absolutely.
So what is it? What are those boundary conditions for you that make you say, "Ooh, it's unethical to take that life"? Right? That's not. I can't take this shot. That's not right for me to take this shot.
Right. So it's not so much actually the unethical to take the life there. It's that shot or the conditions of that shot would cause more harm than. I am either, I've either set that up as a hard line for myself and I just make a rule for it. Like I don't shoot at ducks underneath 40 or out farther than 40 yards. But the thing is I'm not out there to cause pain and suffering. And, you know, I would say 99% of me waiting to be able to, you know, see the eye of a duck, you know, the shine off of it before I, you know, shoot him is out of respect for that duck and, you know, life itself, because it wrenches my gut. Like, a lot of people, you know, will tell you like, oh, hey, whoa, dude, don't waste the shot. Don't waste that bullet. You're just going to put more bullets into the meat. It's already down. It's going to die. Yeah, I take that shot every time. Like,
Right.
I don't like seeing, you know, birds, you know, I'm not that mad at them. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I can get pretty frustrated with the ducks, but I don't get that mad at them. And so when you talk about ethical shots, there's not a lot. I mean, there are guys out there that they don't care. They'll make the unethical shot for the chance at harvesting that buck. And I mean, it's different when you're talking about putting food in the belly. I get that, but I don't know. No hunters that I share a blind with would be okay with, you know, like, oh man, yeah, I tried to take a lucky shot there, and now we can't take that bird anymore, you know. Or like, oh yeah, man, there was no chance of recovering that bird because it landed on the opposite bank, which is not, you know, which is private land. So why shoot it? Just, you know, or one of those things.
Yeah, and I think, which is another thing that I think that a lot of folks often don't keep in mind or don't recognize when they're chatting with hunters is, you know, you obviously don't want it to be so far away that the shot doesn't take the animal down, right? You want to be as precise as possible, because not only do you want to reduce the, not only just practically, you don't want to have to chase the animal, right? You don't want it to run.
Yeah. I mean, and honestly, like, for one, it's an efficiency thing, but number two is okay. You're there are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You're killing something, and that's a inherently serious. You know, that's a heavy thing. That's serious. Right. And so I don't go about that lightly. You know, I don't going out there. I mean, it's one of those things where, you know, when you got it in hand and you're looking at it, and there's a small part in the back of your mind in the back of your heart that, you know, hurts for the bird. And it's such a dichotomous feeling, you know, to talk about, because on one hand, like literally I just spent thousands of dollars over, you know, at the chance to kill this duck, to shoot this duck, to hunt this duck is really what it is. I wanted to hunt this duck, you know. And then now I got it in my hand, and it's part of it is, you know, like a definite reverence, like, thank you very much for this. Like, and then the other part of it is there's still a little bit of that bloodlust excitement, I guess, is what most, you know, non-verse people would call it. If you've never done it, or you've never participated in it, you can't really understand the true range of emotions that a hunter goes through.
Sure. I can, right. I can just imagine. I can't imagine.
Yeah.
And I think it's keeping that square in your mind when you're talking with these people, right? If somebody levels that accusation against you, even you yourself are recognizing a part of that, right? Even you are saying, no, wait, listen, yes, I take this very seriously. Right. So I think keeping that square in mind, you know, that you do go through those range of emotions, right? That it is really, really serious to be doing that. And constantly kind of keeping in mind the gravity of the situation. I think that will help temper you as the hunter as well, in any argument that you have, right? You're not trying to say, oh yeah, this is my right, I can just do whatever I want. Right? You're saying, no, I take this very seriously. You're right. You're right about this. Taking the life is something that is very, very sacred, right? So we have implemented all these rules, right? We have our codes of ethics, and going back to those things. That's very different than just flat out saying that the other person is wrong, right? It's unethical to kill an animal. No, it's perfectly ethical to kill an animal, and here's why. You're not kind of saying that, right? You're sidestepping that by saying, well, you're right. This is a serious situation, but let me help you understand it a little bit better. Let me help you understand what we do and what practices we put in place.
Yeah. How do I translate that to you? You know, as you just saw there, I didn't do a very good job of it. You know, or is it something that you can?
I don't necessarily know that you can directly, you know. Of course, dialogue is such an important part about it, having the conversation. But it's just reminding me and being honest, you know, if you and I are really getting into this, how do you justify this? I think it's just very honest to say, listen, I'm not trying to say that this is an easy issue. I'm not trying to say that this is a very obvious issue. Keeping in mind, this is assuming that somebody is not just coming at you calling you a murderer, right? If they're really over the top, that's not beneficial. So we're assuming that somebody's really trying to get to know you here and really talk to you about this issue. I think it's just good to be honest about that and say, listen, yes, this is almost like a kind of spiritual almost act for me, this whole process, right? A lot of hunters talk about that, you know, about that experience, and it's part of the way that they connect. I think it can help explain to somebody who doesn't understand it to talk about how long this hunting has been a process, right? It seems to be almost in our veins, the process of hunting in general, right?
Yeah.
And we emit these behaviors in so many different ways. So I think, you know, it's just important to non-hunters to restate that that's going on, because it's easy to just to kind of trivialize what hunting is. Yeah, you just go sit in a tree for 6 hours and then you shoot a deer, right? Anybody could do that. So I think part of why hunters are such good conservationists and wildlife experts is because they truly have an intimate, you know, relationship with nature, right? That's the killing process, the hunting process, to put it less aggressively, is a very intimate experience to have with nature, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's participating at a very kind of naked and raw, you know, a way. It really is, you know. So I think it's important to just state those emotions, you know, that they happen, you know, that this experience is like that, because it lets others know how big of a deal it is, you know, that you're taking this very seriously. Because I think that's what most folks are concerned about as well, right? Is that you're just not being conscious about this. You're not being careful. Right.
And I don't think this conversation or this part that we're talking about right now, this doesn't happen on the street, you know.
Well, we don't. It's usually it's over already, right? Because it's so divisive. So you're right. You know, to me, these are the most important conversations to have. Drilling into those. Why? How do you justify that? Well, it's hard. You know, what do you think about this?
What's the most egregious maybe experience you've had with hunting? Like, what's the thing that you're like, oh my goodness, like what is?
I wouldn't like. I mean, honestly, I'm just one of those, man, where it's too gross for me. Some of it, right? Like, definitely. I even never like to gut fish and such, right? So I'm that type. So to a certain extent, that's why I was such a hypocrite in terms of my meat eating for the longest time. I was definitely one of those. I don't want to see how it's prepared. I just want it to get on my plate, right? I don't want to know all the work that goes into it. I just want to eat it. You know what I mean? I just want the burger at the end. So I think some of that is what turned it away. Just the visceral kind of imagery. You know, I'm a little bit of a softie in that regard. And it's just that negative, the idea of killing for me, I just can't do. You know what I mean? Unless it was in a self-defense situation, or something like that. I just can't physically do that. You know what I mean? I can't do it. I don't think it makes me better than anybody. I don't think it makes me worse than anybody, either. Right. I also think that that's a problem.
So is it ever, I know that one time I did take you out, is it ever a possibility that you would ever sit in a duck blind with me?
I would. I definitely would. I love the experience of just being out there, you know, as well. So I definitely would. And it's not as though I would, you know, freak out, at the sight of an animal being killed. But it's just not something that I would enjoy, right? I wouldn't get joy. Everything but the end result of killing would still be of taking the shot would be good for me. But
I mean, I think you almost have to do it now as just
what's going to happen?
An experiment of.
You just got to test it out.
Yeah, you have to test it out because I see. Yeah, we'll do another episode after that happens. How's that sound?
Let's do it. We should meet back up and after that and do another follow up. I think that would be fun.
Yeah, definitely. Just because I think a lot of people will. I hope some people will stick it out this conversation, but they might hear like you say. Yeah, no, I've never shot a duck. I've, went hunting a couple of times with my dad once, and maybe turn it off. Be like, I don't want to listen to this guy. And I think
they very well could. Hopefully, anybody that doesn't do that, right? Hopefully, they're able to hear some sides of the argument, of course, that help prepare them for how to have those conversations. But once again, I think the people who are still listening right now are people who have had these awkward conversations with family or friends that are close, right? It's easy to just push away somebody who's not in a close relationship with you, right? Who cares? As you just said, right? Oh, that's some guy who doesn't know what he's talking about. It's easy to do that with just some guy, right? But it's harder to have those conversations if there's been anybody in your family that's really made you feel bad for being a hunter, right? Or maybe you've got a vegetarian in the family who you're ostracizing as well because they're super anti what you do, right? You just can't find. Maybe that's just that, you went away to college and took one too many ethics courses and now, and now they're intolerable as well. You know what I mean? I'm kind of joking. I fit into that category, right? But maybe you're that as well. And hopefully maybe some of those folks that are still listening got an understanding for, just because those people have those strong views doesn't mean that they can't have a dialogue. They do need to be respectful of you just as you need to be respectful of them, But I think those are the folks who would still be listening at this point, right? It's because you've had one of these conversations or many, or several.
Right. Yeah. So,
what do you want to chat about next?
I don't know. I say we go on for just another 5 minutes or so, and just cover some. I don't know. It's just very interesting to kind of see what you know or you don't know about hunting. But it's always fun to just kind of educate and inform, and just to get your take on your response on something. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, so,
right.
Okay. I guess I'll ask you this question as a non-hunter, and then, all right, we'll get into it. So, okay. Do you know how many ducks that I can shoot per day?
I have no idea.
Can you take a guess?
So this is like a kill limit per day during the hunting season.
Yes.
Gosh, I can't even wrap my head around that number. It's got to be small. I feel like I see folks, never having maybe more than 5 or 10 that they kill in a day, maybe. So can you kill as many as 10?
Yeah, it's nice. It's generally 6 in most areas.
Nice. So, I nailed one. I nailed it.
Absolutely nailed it almost. Okay, so question for you then. All right, just to see how you would react to this. Bird comes in, I shoot at it, I see that it has been wounded, and it flies away 40 yards into some brush, and I go over there. How long do I look for it?
How long are you required to look for it, or how long just should you?
How long should I look for it?
Oh, man. So you shoot an animal, it's over there, you're trying to find it. Man, I would... Well, part of the answer is to me, right? Does that count against your limit then, of course, if you don't find it?
Well, that was going to be my segue question is okay, so you think that should count as one of my 6 birds?
Man. So, I'm going to take the ethical purist stance, and be like, man, you should look for at least, I think, 20 to 30 minutes. It seems to be a reasonable amount of time. I suppose it would be dependent upon the terrain, of course. But yeah, if you're going to if you're going to still stay with the conservation part, right? of hunting, then if you killed that animal, right, that was what you were doing for conservation, right? The conservation part wasn't what you did with the body after you got it, but the conservation part was the money that you put into the licenses, and so those limits on how many you can kill, I think is independent of whether or not you get the bird, whether or not you get it.
Okay.
That's what I think.
Okay. Okay. Here's another good question. Okay. Is it better or worse, or which one's more ethical, to shoot a duck that is flying around, or to shoot a duck that has then landed in your decoy spread and it's just, what's going on here? Is there any difference?
So, difference between shooting a bird that's in flight versus one that has landed near you. I feel like it is more ethical to shoot the flying bird.
Okay.
Off the top of my head.
Nice.
I feel like
any particular reason, or?
I think maybe just because the quickness of the death, or not knowing it. It's kind of the standard where in one instance you're just it's kind of just the proverbial die in your sleep versus being aware that you're in this weird situation. I guess being
okay. So yeah. So if it were you, you'd rather be like shot just riding your bike past the mall, not standing around a bunch of mannequins.
Exactly. Yeah. That's where I'd like to. Yeah. I want to roll up on a bunch of mannequins and then find out I'm in some sort of weird weekend trip,
Sorry, the picture of that is just hilarious to me. It's morbid, but
it's very morbid. Very morbid, but I suppose if I had to choose, that's what I would choose.
Oh my gosh. Okay, next one. What's a good question here? Okay. How much money do you think I spent? Or actually, how much money is the, and I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but it's called the duck stamp. So in addition to your hunting license that you have to have, in addition to everything else you have to be licensed for, you have to have this thing called a duck stamp to be legally able to hunt waterfowl. It's federal since, birds don't have resident states.
Right.
They fly everywhere. So
right.
How much do you think the waterfowl stamp cost this year?
Oh gosh, $20.
Yeah. Wow. Did you study or something?
I totally guessed. I had no idea.
I think it was like $27 is about what it was this year.
And that's crazy. I swear I'm literally guessing. I have no idea what that dollar amount was. I'm just lucky today.
Yeah. So, well, I think that's good. I think we can end on that. I think we were a little looser than we wanted to be, and we can probably definitely at some point dial in our dialogue on this. But I think all in all, what are the end states out of this? What do we want the listeners to be getting out of this?
I hope it came together good. Of course, we'll definitely listen to it afterwards again and see how well the message came across. But what I definitely hope listeners would have gotten is to, one, first and foremost, be very, very careful about the arguments that you're having, right? Be really precise in what you're specifically talking about. Are you discussing the ethics of killing versus the ethics of doing something that you love versus personal ethics versus whether or not there should be laws against it, right? So I think to just be very, very precise in your argumentation as best as you can, and also be compassionate. Just to remember that if somebody is an anti-hunter or a non-hunter, you're both coming from a standpoint of preservation of life. Right. So keep going back to that common ground in your argument, as opposed to just trying to defend yourself or get defensive. So be as precise as you can, be compassionate, and go back to the things that you share. The ideas that you do share, which is the communing with wildlife, promoting the well-being of wildlife. Go back to those things. And then I think third, be honest about the fact that you're using a lot of utilitarian arguments. Those are very good. And many non-hunters are not aware of that, right? They're not aware that hunting often generates more conservation dollars than many of the alternatives. They're not aware of all the different ways that they might think that they're benefiting wildlife, when in actuality they're hurting wildlife, right? So if you follow the first two steps of being as precise as possible and being compassionate, then you'll open the door to be able to actually educate them, which is your only chance of potentially changing their mind, right? Or making them come to understand you. The more you kind of follow that path, the more opportunities you'll have to have more in-depth conversations with people about these topics, right? That doesn't just quickly devolve into bickering. And so that'll just make you better as a hunter and better as a human being and better as a thinker as well. At least I definitely believe that at the core of my being.
Yeah. Hey, man, I appreciate you coming on and talk about hunting for an hour and a half.
Perfect, man. Loved it. Let's do some hunting together, and I'll come along with you, and then meet back again and do another podcast about that. I think that'd be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll take Dad too. That'll be a hoot. So
let's do it. He's
always good for a couple laughs in the blind.
We'll get all three of us on here. We'll get talking for 5-6 hours.
Oh gosh. And it'd be really funny to take Jeb out.
That'd be another one. That's I don't know if you haven't. We'd have to extend the podcast a lot longer than that if we take Jeb out.
Oh, I know. But all right, well, shall we wrap it up?
On. Absolutely, man. Appreciate it. Hope all the listeners enjoyed it. I'm interested in any comments or feedback folks have. And yeah, thanks for having me on the podcast, man.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Fowl Front Waterfowl Podcast. Please come join us on our Facebook group, the Fowl Front Waterfowl Podcast group, where you can connect with a good group of hunters, because we're all in this together. We need to act like it so that hopefully our great grandkids will be hunting ducks over our favorite public lands. We also ask that you go ahead and give us a written review on iTunes and give us 5 stars if you think we deserve it. And we really do want to hear back from you so that we can give you the best possible content. And if you get in on that Facebook group, you can get in there and you can ask questions and you can tell us what you want to hear next, or you can tell us what you don't like, and we'll be sure to tailor things to our listeners. So, all right. Stay safe out there, and we will see you next week.